The first rays of the sun, painted in hues of fiery gold and soft rose, struggled to pierce the dense morning mist that clung to the village of Azul. This was a land blessed by the earth, where the soil was rich and the rivers flowed with the wisdom of the ancestors, but a quiet sorrow often slept beneath the tranquil surface. In the heart of the compound, a girl of barely 10 years moved with a grace far older than her age. Her name was Amaka, which means beautiful or graceful in her mother's tongue, a name that seemed a promise of the light she carried within her bright, observant eyes. Yet, those eyes often held a flicker of fear, a shadow cast by the heavy duties placed upon her young shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from the communal hearths, but Amaka did not pause to appreciate the morning's quiet beauty. Her small hands were already calloused from hauling water from the distant well, a task assigned to her before the rooster's first crow, as if to test the limit of her frail strength. She wore a simple, patched cotton dress, faded from countless washings, and her spirit often felt as threadbare as her garment. Even the simplest mistakes brought harsh reprimands from the head of the house, a woman whose heart seemed to have been hardened by years of quiet bitterness and unforgiving traditions. This compound, surrounded by the sturdy mud and thatch walls that symbolized security to others, felt more like a prison to Amaka. The silence before dawn was not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of expectation and the ever-present threat of displeasure, marking the beginning of another long day. Amaka balanced a massive clay water gourd on her head, its round belly filled to the brim with the cold, clear water she had fetched. The weight pressed down on her neck and spine, making her slight body tremble with the effort, a perpetual test of endurance she was forced to pass daily. She moved with meticulous slowness, her bare feet silent against the dusty path, knowing that a single misplaced step, a moment of childish carelessness, would send the precious water spilling into the dust. Such a waste would invite a storm of anger, more painful than the physical strain she was already enduring. From the doorway of the largest hut, the figure of Mama Neka, the matriarch, watched Amaka with a gaze that held no warmth, only sharp scrutiny. Mama Neka saw not a hard-working child, but an obligation and a means to maintain the harsh, rigid order she believed was necessary for the family's survival and reputation. Amaka consciously kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, avoiding the eyes that judged her every movement. She understood instinctively that seeking sympathy or showing fatigue would only be interpreted as weakness, justifying even stricter discipline in the name of molding her character. Finally, she reached the designated storage area and gently lowered the heavy gourd, her arms shaking violently now that the burden was lifted. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself a deep, ragged breath, the only reward for completing the morning's most taxing chore before the rest of the household stirred. In a small, private moment before the morning chaos, Amaka retreated to the quiet corner of the compound where a lone, ancient acacia tree stood, its branches twisting toward the sky like gnarled, sorrowful arms. This was her sanctuary, the place she felt closest to the memory of her mother. Her mother, Adana, had possessed a spirit as bright and vibrant as the most colorful market cloth, a laughter that was like the chime of brass bells. Amaka could still vividly recall the soft scent of shea butter and storytelling that clung to her mother's embrace, a memory now precious and terribly fragile. Adana had been gone for 2 years, taken by a sudden illness that the village healer could not defeat, leaving Amaka an orphan in a world that suddenly turned cold and unforgiving. Her mother's absence was a constant, dull ache beneath Amaka's breastbone, a wound that never truly closed. Amaka reached out a hand and touched the rough bark of the acacia tree, tracing the deep grooves with a tender reverence. She imagined the tree was listening, a silent witness to her daily struggles, and she whispered her worries into the wind, her voice barely audible above the rustle of the dry leaves. It was here, under the sheltering canopy, that Amaka found the strength to face the day, drawing courage from the invisible presence of her mother's love. She knew Adana would have wanted her to be strong, to endure, and to never let the harshness of others extinguish the flame of her gentle spirit. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dust of the compound into a shimmering haze, and the family gathered for the main meal. Platters of steaming yams, rich vegetable stew, and grilled fish were spread out, a generous and comforting display of prosperity and communal effort. Amaka was the last to be served, not at the main table but squatting slightly apart, near the cooking fire where she had spent the last hour tending the flames. Her portion was meager, a small, sad mound of congealed yam and a few spoonfuls of broth scraped from the bottom of the pot, deliberately placed to reflect her lower standing. Her hunger was a constant, gnawing pain, a familiar companion that she tried to ignore by focusing on the tasks that still lay ahead. She ate slowly, savoring every mouthful, not out of pleasure, but out of necessity, knowing that this small meal would have to sustain her through the long afternoon and evening. Mama Neka, seated regally and eating with an air of absolute command, did not speak to Amaka, but often glanced toward her with a look of pointed disapproval. This silent judgment felt heavier than any spoken word, ensuring that everyone present was aware of Amaka's position as the least valued member of the household. A younger cousin, Kofi, a boy of Amaka's age, briefly caught her eye and offered a quick, sympathetic frown before quickly looking away, intimidated by his mother's presence. That fleeting moment of shared humanity was a tiny, precious gift that Amaka quickly tucked away to keep the loneliness at bay. The afternoon task was sorting the grain, a repetitive and mind-numbing labor that required hours of careful attention to separate the good kernels from the chaff and tiny stones. Amaka sat on a low stool, her back aching from the morning's chores, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion. In a moment of profound fatigue, her hand slipped, and a small, antique earthen pot used for storing the finest millet tumbled from a high shelf where she was reaching. It hit the hard-packed earth with a sickening, brittle crunch, shattering into dozens of sharp, irreparable pieces. The sound was shockingly loud in the sudden, suspended silence of the compound, a sound that immediately summoned Mama Neka from her afternoon nap. Her face, usually stern, was now contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury, her eyes narrowed like a striking cobra. "Careless, useless girl." Mama Neka's voice was a low, dangerous hiss, vibrating with an intensity that made Amaka flinch and curl inward. It was not just the pot, but the underlying resentment for Amaka's existence, her connection to a past Mama Neka wished to erase, that fueled the outburst. Amaka immediately began to weep, not from the fear of physical punishment which she knew was coming, but from the deep, crushing shame of her failure and the knowledge that she had just caused her burden to become even heavier, trapping her further in the cycle of disapproval and suffering. Mama Neka did not waste words. Her actions were swift, brutal, and calculated to instill absolute compliance. She retrieved a thin, tightly braided switch, dried and stiffened over time, a tool of discipline that she wielded not just with strength, but with cold, surgical precision. Amaka instinctively pressed her hands over her head, her body shaking uncontrollably, the tears still streaming down her dusty cheeks, smearing the grime into trails of mud. The sight of the switch, more than the pain itself, symbolized the shattering of any hope for kindness or forgiveness. The first strike sliced through the air with a horrifying snap, landing sharply across Amaka's thin back. It wasn't just a physical blow. It was a resounding confirmation of her utter powerlessness, the sound echoing the silent screams of her trapped, suffering spirit. She bit down hard on her lip to stifle the cry, forcing the pain inward, a desperate act of self-preservation to avoid giving Mama Neka the satisfaction of hearing her openly wail. Every strike fueled the desperate resolution in her heart. I must endure. I must not break. When the punishment finally ceased, leaving raw, angry welts blooming beneath her threadbare clothing, Amaka collapsed onto the broken pieces of the pot. She lay there, not moving, the searing pain a fierce, constant reminder of the world's indifference, yet her spirit, though wounded, refused to be extinguished. Later that night, long after the compound had fallen into the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleep, Amaka crept out of the dark, stuffy corner she was assigned. Her muscles screamed in protest with every movement, but the necessity of escape, even for a moment, overshadowed the agony. She moved like a phantom, guided only by the soft, silvery light of the crescent moon, her footsteps cautious and deliberate. Her destination was the ancient acacia tree, her silent confessor, the only place where she felt she could shed the heavy, performative mask of compliance she wore during the day. She sank to the ground, leaning her aching back against the sturdy trunk, and allowed herself the luxury of weeping silently, the tears falling onto the dry earth like tiny, warm raindrops. She spoke to the tree, to the night sky, and to the memory of her mother, pouring out the fear and the unbearable loneliness. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "Why did you leave me here? I try to be strong, but the darkness is so deep." The pain was not just physical now. It was a spiritual exhaustion, the weariness of perpetually fighting a battle she could never truly win. Under the watchful, silent stars of the African night, Amaka took a small piece of dried root, a relic from her mother's herb pouch, and pressed it tightly against her chest. This was her vow, to hold on to the memory of love, a tiny ember of warmth against the freezing cold of her reality. The next morning, while sweeping the courtyard, Amaka's gaze met that of Chaik, a young boy who worked for a neighboring Kinder family, often bringing errands to Mama Neka's compound. Chaik was slightly older and always watched Amaka with a mix of pity and quiet admiration for her silent fortitude. As he spoke briefly with Mama Neka at the gate, exchanging polite but wary formalities, Chaik subtly maneuvered a small, woven basket he carried, using the distraction to his advantage. He ensured he stood near the pile of dry palm fronds Amaka was meticulously gathering. As he turned to leave, he made a show of stumbling slightly, and a perfect, deep red mango, ripe and heavy with sweetness, seemingly rolled unnoticed from his basket and came to rest near Amaka's feet, hidden by a clump of tall weeds. Their eyes locked for only a fraction of a second, a fleeting moment of shared conspiracy. Chaik gave the quickest, most imperceptible shake of his head, communicating the need for absolute secrecy before he continued on his way, leaving Amaka breathless with surprise. Later, huddled behind the storage shed, Amaka devoured the mango, the juice running down her chin like liquid gold. This small, perfect act of kindness was a potent antidote to the poison of her daily life, proving that goodness still existed outside the walls of her suffering, filling her with a renewed, albeit fragile, hope. Weeks turned into months, and the constant strain, the relentless labor, the lack of nourishing food, and the perpetual state of stress began to take a visible, devastating toll on Amaka. Her bright eyes lost their luminescence, becoming heavy and shadowed. Her movements, once graceful even under burden, became slow and hesitant, the movements of a tired old woman. The vibrant energy that had been the hallmark of her youth was systematically drained away, leaving her pale, thin, and brittle, a ghost moving through the sunlit compound. Mama Neka seemed oblivious or deliberately indifferent to the visible decline. The matriarch simply saw this fatigue as laziness, necessitating harsher commands and sharper words, a brutal feedback loop that drove Amaka closer to the edge of collapse. Amaka herself retreated further into a silent world, the pain becoming a background noise that she no longer fought with tears or defiance, but met with a hollow-eyed resignation. She focused on the mechanical aspects of her chores, allowing her mind to drift to the distant, peaceful river where she imagined her mother was waiting. One evening, while stirring a meager pot of corn gruel, Amaka accidentally scraped the back of her hand against the hot side of the hearth. She barely flinched, staring blankly at the rising blister. The realization struck her with cold clarity. Her body was still registering the pain, but her spirit had become profoundly, dangerously numb. The physical breaking point arrived with a relentless, bone-chilling fever that began one rainy afternoon. Amaka was soaked and exhausted from carrying heavy sacks of newly threshed cassava, and the cold had settled deep within her starved frame. She was relegated to her corner, shaking violently under a thin, damp blanket. The fever warped her reality, plunging her into terrifying, vivid dreams where the walls of the compound closed in on her, and Mama Neka's stern face loomed large, a symbol of the suffocating injustice. In the midst of the delirium, the spirit of her mother, Adana, finally appeared. Adana was dressed in pure white, radiating a soft, gentle light, her face etched with profound sorrow and unconditional love as she stroked Amaka's burning brow. "My star," Adana's voice whispered, sounding like the soft rustle of dry leaves. "You have endured enough. Hold on to the light, my child. Not here, not for this world." This was not a plea to fight, but a gentle, spiritual permission to finally rest, a release from the eternal struggle. When she woke, the fever had momentarily broken, leaving her weak but lucid. Amaka knew then that her time in this world was nearing its end. There was a quiet dignity in the realization, a final moment of choice. She chose not to fear the end, but to embrace the promise of reunion with the love she had lost. Despite the debilitating weakness, the well still called, its duty relentless. Mama Neka stood over her, impatient, dismissing Amaka's obvious illness as a ploy for sympathy or avoidance of work. The words were a sharp dismissal. "Get up, Amaka. The house needs water." Amaka struggled to her feet, her legs feeling like unstable reeds, every muscle trembling with effort. She picked up the two empty gourds. The weight of them, usually negligible, now felt like carrying stones. This final walk, she realized, would be the most difficult one of her life. As she stepped outside, the sun, usually a welcome source of warmth, felt searing and oppressive. The path to the well, familiar from countless journeys, seemed impossibly long, stretching out like a tortuous, endless ribbon of red earth. She reached the well, the communal hub of the village, where other women glanced at her, their expressions a mixture of sympathy, discomfort, and the fear of interfering in another family's business. Amaka was a visible, tragic spectacle of neglect. With a final, desperate surge of will, she filled the gourds, hauling the rope up slowly, her frail arms shaking. Just as she managed to lift the water to the well's edge, a deep wave of blackness crashed over her vision, and the world began to tilt violently. Amaka's grip slipped, not from carelessness, but from a total, catastrophic failure of her body. One gourd tumbled back into the dark well with a heavy splash, and the second one crashed onto the stone rim, spilling its contents in a mournful gush of water. She made a quiet, gasping sound, more of surprise than pain, as her knees buckled. Her body seemed to melt downwards, hitting the unforgiving ground with a soft, final thud, stirring up a small cloud of dust that settled instantly on her lifeless form. A collective gasp went up from the women at the well. They rushed forward, but there was a palpable sense of dread, of knowing they were too late. Amaka's breathing was shallow, a faint, ragged thread, and her eyes, though slightly open, were unfocused, staring into a world beyond their own. One woman, Ngozi, knelt beside her, tears welling up in her own eyes as she gently lifted Amaka's head onto her lap. She whispered prayers and words of comfort, a final, belated offering of human warmth that Amaka was now too far gone to register. News of the collapse traveled like wildfire through the village, a silent ripple of shame and deep sadness. Amaka, the silent, suffering child, had finally yielded to the cruel weight placed upon her, right in the heart of the community that had failed to protect her. Mama Neka arrived at the well shortly after, her face a mask of annoyance, quickly shifting to a practiced look of grief upon seeing the crowd. But the practiced sorrow did not hide the underlying, cold calculation of the matriarch, who was more concerned with reputation than loss. The village elder, Og Weifai, a man respected for his wisdom and quiet justice, pushed through the crowd. He looked down at Amaka's still form, then slowly raised his gaze to meet Mama Neka's eyes. In his expression was a terrible, quiet judgment that spoke volumes. "She is gone," Ngozi confirmed, her voice cracking with sorrow, starved of kindness and life, while standing beside the water that gives life. Her words, simple and direct, were a heavy accusation that hung in the air, indicting the entire community. Mama Neka attempted to assert authority, to dismiss the death as a natural illness, but the silence of the crowd was a tangible wall of disapproval. No one spoke, but their averted eyes and drawn faces communicated the truth. They all knew what had happened. Amaka's small body was lifted gently and carried back to the compound, not by her household, but by the women of the village, a final act of respect. The very earth seemed to absorb her spirit, a silent oath that her suffering would not be forgotten. The mourning rituals began immediately, but they were hollow, performed only to satisfy tradition and ward off public scrutiny. Mama Neka orchestrated the proceedings with theatrical efficiency, demanding wails and lamentations from her household that rang false to the ears of the grieving villagers. Amaka's body was washed and dressed in a simple white cloth, a final preparation for the journey. As the village women tended to this sacred task, they saw the undeniable evidence of long-term suffering. The scars, the thinness, the exhaustion etched into her young features. They anointed her with oils and wrapped her carefully, each gentle touch a silent apology for their failure to intervene sooner. The scent of frankincense and myrrh filled the small hut, attempting to mask the deeper, bitter odor of neglect and injustice. Outside, the acacia tree seemed to weep, its dry leaves fluttering to the ground like mournful confetti. The village knew that her life was not taken by sickness alone, but by a chilling, calculated cruelty, and the land itself seemed to be registering the profound imbalance. That night, as the funeral drums beat a slow, heavy rhythm, a strange, unnatural cold descended upon the compound, chilling the air far beyond the reach of the season. The very spirit of the village felt uneasy, sensing that this death was not a true ending, but a fearful beginning. 3 days after Amaka was buried beneath the weeping acacia tree, the true reckoning began, starting with the land itself. The morning sky, usually clear, was a bruised, sickly purple, and the air was thick with a buzzing, unnerving silence. Mama Neka woke to a sickening realization. The huge, healthy yam crop, the pride of her last harvest and her guarantee of wealth, had withered overnight. Every single mound of earth was topped with black, rotten vines. The yams beneath turned to bitter, useless pulp. She rushed to the chicken coops, where her prized flock of white hens, essential for ritual and trade, lay still. They were untouched by predators, but all were dead, their feathers ruffled, their eyes wide with a silent, invisible terror. Panic began to rise in the compound. The head herdsman reported that the cows refused to be milked. Their udders were dry, and they mooed mournfully toward the acacia tree, their large eyes filled with a strange, spiritual dread. The village elder, Ab Wayfi, arrived, his face grim. "The land has rejected the fruit of your hands, Mama Neka," he pronounced, his voice low and solemn. "The ancestors have seen the injustice done beneath their sky, and the spirit of the child is restless." The spiritual manifestation of Amaka's suffering intensified, moving beyond crops and livestock to the very structure of the home. That evening, as the family ate a meager, tense meal, a sudden, powerful gust of wind, though the rest of the night was still, slammed through the main hut. The wind was icy cold, carrying a faint, unmistakable scent of shea butter and tears, the unique, heartbreaking scent that the villagers associated with Amaka's late mother. It extinguished every lamp and fire, plunging the room into absolute darkness. From the blackness, a sound began, a faint, low whimpering, a raw, wounded sound that slowly amplified, moving from a child's sob to a deep, resonant cry of profound spiritual pain. It was Amaka's sorrow, given voice and magnified 100-fold. Mama Neka screamed, a high, panicked sound that shattered her facade of control. She scrambled backwards, stumbling over stools and possessions, suddenly terrified not of the villagers' judgment, but of a presence she could not fight or contain. The voice seemed to focus its sorrow directly on Mama Neka, a wave of palpable, chilling grief that felt like a physical blow. The message was clear. The time for hiding the truth was over. The suffering endured was now being returned, magnified by spiritual power. The next day, a bizarre drought settled only upon Mama Neka's compound. While the rest of Azu enjoyed the morning dew and the clean, flowing river water, every water gourd and storage pot in her home was mysteriously and entirely empty. She sent her remaining servants and children multiple times to the well, but the water they brought back, once poured into her vessels, vanished instantly, not spilled, but simply gone, leaving only dry, cracked clay behind. Mama Neka was seized by a terrible, unquenchable thirst that felt like a fire in her throat. She drank directly from the river, but the water tasted like dust and ashes on her tongue, offering no relief, only a dry, desperate craving. The haunting thirst was a symbolic reversal of the injustice. Amaka, starved of water and nourishment, now visited that terrible emptiness upon the one who had condemned her. The matriarch, who had controlled access to every resource, was now denied the most basic necessity for life. She tried to steal water from a neighbor's pot under the cover of dusk, an act of sheer desperation that destroyed the last vestiges of her dignity. But as her hand reached the edge, the gourd inexplicably flew from its place and shattered against the wall, driven by an unseen force. Driven by fear and mounting public suspicion, Mama Neka sought the counsel of the village diviner, Ao, a wise, ancient woman whose sight pierced the veil of the material world. Ao was reluctant but agreed to perform the consultation ritual by the light of a single, flickering flame. Ao cast cowrie shells onto a worn leather mat, her eyes closed in deep concentration. As she chanted, the shells began to rearrange themselves, forming complex, damning patterns that spelled out the truth of Amaka's torment and final hours. When she opened her eyes, they were filled not with fear, but with a terrible pity. The child's spirit is bound by sorrow, Ao intoned, her voice echoing in the small, smoke-filled room. She seeks not death for you, but the truth to be known. Ao then held up a small, highly polished piece of obsidian, a sacred mirror. Look into this, Mama Neka, she commanded. See not your face, but the face of your deeds. Mama Neka reluctantly peered into the stone. Instead of her reflection, she saw a clear, terrifying vision of Amaka's final, exhausted collapse at the well. Then, the vision shifted to the painful lashing and the meager scraps of food she was given, a relentless reel of her cruelty. She screamed and threw the mirror down, unable to bear the weight of her own sin reflected back at her. The spiritual assault was unrelenting. Her body weakened, her mind frayed, and her terrifying thirst intensified. Finally, on the seventh night after Amaka's passing, Mama Neka could endure no more. The shame and the spirit's quiet fury broke her completely. She rushed out of her hut and ran to the center of the village square, where the moonlight illuminated the ancient communal meeting circle. Her hair was wild, her clothes disheveled, and her voice hoarse and raw from her endless, fruitless attempts to find water. She fell to her knees, raising her face to the indifferent stars, and began to wail not the performative grief of the funeral, but a genuine, soul-deep cry of agonizing repentance. The villagers, roused by her screams, gathered in the shadows, watching the spectacle in stunned silence. I did it. I starved her, she shrieked, her voice cracking with the terrible admission. I broke the gourd and beat her for a child's honest mistake. I let her die for want of love and food. The confession tumbled out, a raw, unforgiving torrent of truth. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had choked the village since the death suddenly lifted, replaced by a deep, palpable sense of sorrow. The wind sighed through the palm trees, no longer a weapon, but a sound of released tension, confirming that the spiritual mandate had been fulfilled. The next morning, the village elder and the council gathered at the acacia tree for a final, solemn ceremony. Mama Neka, now gaunt and humbled, stood before them, having confessed her crimes to the ancestors and the community. The council declared that she would not be banished, as the spirit's work was not physical punishment, but spiritual and societal correction. Her sentence was a life of public atonement. She was stripped of her title and wealth and given the most humble, taxing chores of the village, the exact work she had forced upon Amaka. As the sun reached its peak, Ogwayfi placed a small, smooth, white stone at the foot of Amaka's grave. Amaka, he spoke to the earth, his voice ringing with reverence. The truth is known. Your spirit is free. Rest now, child, in the arms of your mother. A single, beautiful red hibiscus flower, impossibly out of season, suddenly unfurled its delicate petals on a branch of the old, weary acacia tree right over the grave. It was a visible sign, a final, poignant confirmation that Amaka's soul had found peace. The coldness left the land, and moments later, the first drops of gentle, life-giving rain began to fall, softly cleansing the dust of the compound and washing away the tears of a long-suffering village. The spirit of Amaka had come not for blood, but for justice and truth, allowing the light to return to the heart of Azu. Mama Neka, stripped of her elaborate cloth wrappers and heavy bronze jewelry, sat hunched in the center of her massive hut. The space, once a proud symbol of her authority, now felt cavernous and hostile, its walls pressing in on her with the weight of her solitude. The elaborate carvings on the support poles, the smooth, dark clay floor she had commanded be kept immaculate. All of it mocked her now, remnants of a power that had vanished like morning dew under the sun. She had lost not just her status, but the very meaning of her life, which had been built on control. She reached out a trembling hand and touched a stack of brightly colored cloth, a fine acquisition she had long coveted. Instead of the satisfying feel of silk, her fingers registered only a rough, itchy texture, and the cloth felt cold, like a shroud. There was no comfort in wealth, no solace in the memory of her past dominance. Her internal landscape was a desert, mirroring the thirst that still occasionally gripped her, a thirst not just for water, but for the moral purity she had destroyed. She was utterly alone, adrift in the vast, empty sea of her own making, realizing that her cruelty to Amaka had been a self-inflicted wound, slowly poisoning the very core of her own being until she was left with nothing but a haunting echo of a child's quiet suffering. The morning sun found Mama Neka at the well, performing the task Amaka had dreaded, the long, arduous haul of water. She wore a simple, undyed tunic, and the large clay gourd she carried felt impossibly heavy, a leaden weight on her shoulder. She moved clumsily, her once confident gait replaced by a fearful shuffle, terrified of making the slightest mistake under the collective, piercing gaze of the other village women. They did not shout or scorn her. Their silence was far more potent and shaming. Each time the rope burned her aging palms, she saw a flashback. Amaka's small, scraped hands, constantly working, constantly strained. The physical discomfort of the water carrying was a direct, visceral connection to the years of silent torment she had inflicted. A few younger women, who had been Amaka's peers, watched her with expressions that shifted from anger to a chilling, cold pity. They averted their eyes quickly when she looked up, an unspoken acknowledgement that her suffering was deserved, but ultimately beneath their concern. As she finally staggered back to her compound, the water in the gourd sloshing precariously, Mama Neka realized the burden she carried was no longer just the water, but the heavy, unshakable mantle of her sin, a weight she was condemned to bear with every aching step. Inside the compound, young Kofi, her grandnephew, was tasked with sweeping the courtyard near where Mama Neka had to deposit the water. Their work brought them into close proximity, forcing a confrontation neither of them wanted. Kofi, usually bright and talkative, was utterly silent, his small brow furrowed in concentration on the dust. He swept with mechanical efficiency, ensuring there was always a respectable space between his body and hers, a distance that felt miles wide. Mama Neka tried to speak, to offer a simple greeting. "Kofi, the sun is high." But the words caught in her throat. She saw in his young eyes not the warmth of family, but a raw, unblinking recollection of the cruel woman who had punished Amaka so relentlessly. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the ground, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly every time she moved. This rejection from Kofi, the child who had once crawled into her lap for treats, was a deep, aching testament to the destructive nature of her past actions. The brief encounter ended with Kofi quickly retreating inside, leaving Mama Neka standing alone in the center of the yard, understanding that the damage she had wrought was not just to Amaka, but to the fabric of love and trust within her own family. The midday meal was now a sober, communal affair, with family members and workers sharing a simple porridge. Mama Neka was served last, her bowl containing the thinnest gruel and a few hard, dry kernels of corn, the literal scraps. She lifted the spoon, her hand shaking slightly, and tried to eat. The food felt gritty, dry, and fundamentally unappetizing. Her hunger was real, a constant background pain, yet every mouthful was an effort, a spiritual blockade to nourishment. As she chewed, she saw Amaka's face vividly, the wide, tired eyes watching the others eat, the controlled way she ate her small portions, trying to draw every ounce of sustenance from the meager offering. The memory choked her. Mama Neka pushed the bowl away, unable to force another mouthful. The food, though simple, was clean, but to her palate, it was imbued with the taste of ashes, a bitter reminder that she had allowed a child to suffer chronic hunger while she feasted. She sat there, bowed over the uneaten meal, understanding that the spiritual famine she had created could not be cured by food. It required the slow, difficult nourishment of genuine regret and moral restoration. Night brought no respite. Mama Neka lay on her mat, piled high with thick blankets, but a strange, persistent cold permeated her bones. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the outside air, but originated deep inside her chest, radiating outwards. The shivering was violent and uncontrollable, a full-body tremor that rattled her teeth and made sleep impossible. She felt perpetually exposed, as if stripped naked and left in a winter storm, mirroring the emotional exposure Amaka had faced every day. She imagined Amaka, sleeping on her thin mat in the corner, her body too thin to hold warmth, enduring this same profound chill not for one night, but for years. The realization intensified her own freezing misery. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to compress the chill, but it was relentless. It was the icy touch of the spirit, a symbolic repayment of the lack of warmth, the utter dearth of human kindness she had dispensed. The shivering finally subsided just before dawn, leaving her utterly exhausted, but with a clear, searing insight. She was experiencing the physical manifestation of the cold-heartedness that had defined her rule over Amaka. Her humble chores were plagued by minor, unnerving disturbances. She would sweep the central compound dust into a neat pile, only to turn her back for a moment and find it scattered again, as if by a careless child's foot. She spent an hour meticulously arranging the firewood, only to return minutes later and find the pieces tossed haphazardly, forcing her to repeat the frustrating labor. These acts were not violent, but subtly weary and infantile. Mama Neka realized this was the lingering presence of Amaka's spirit, a tired, persistent echo of a child who was forced to work beyond her years and constantly made to repeat tasks due to exhaustion or simple errors. She stopped fighting it. When the dust scattered, she simply sighed, picked up her broom, and started again, speaking softly to the empty air. "Forgive me, little one. I know this is tiresome." The realization that Amaka was still bound to the physical world through the chores she died performing brought a fresh wave of sorrow. Mama Neka now shared the burden, doing the work not just as atonement, but as a shared duty with the spirit of the lost. Sleep, when it finally came, brought a recurring dream of heartbreaking beauty. Mama Neka found herself standing in a sunny clearing, watching Amaka, who looked about 8 years old, glowing with health and happiness. Amaka was dressed in a vibrant yellow dress, her hair braided with beads, and she was soaring on a rope swing, pumping her legs joyfully. Her face was lit with pure, unadulterated laughter, the sound as bright and clear as distant bells. In the dream, Amaka did not see Mama Neka, but she looked toward a future filled with promise, her small, powerful body reaching for the limitless blue sky. It was the life Mama Neka had brutally crushed through years of toil and starvation. Mama Neka would wake up gasping for air, her face wet with tears that were not of self-pity, but of genuine, excruciating grief for the joyous spirit she had extinguished before its time. She wept for the beautiful life Amaka never lived. The dream was a spiritual gift, showing her not her sin, but the magnitude of her loss, the loss of a loving, flourishing child she could have cherished. It cemented her resolve to atone for the wasted potential. Ogwefai, the village elder, came to her, a staff of polished Irako wood in his hand, his eyes filled with the deep, patient wisdom of a lifetime spent observing human frailty. He sat with her by the fire, letting the silence settle before he spoke. "The spirit of Amaka has done its work, Mama Neka," he said quietly. "It has forced the truth from your mouth. But spirits seek freedom, and Amakis will not fully rest while your own heart is still churning with despair." He explained that justice was not simply punishment, but the restoration of balance. She could not repay the life, but she could dedicate the remainder of her own to creating the kindness that Amaka was denied. "Find true humility. Find the grace you denied her," Ogwefai advised, his voice gentle but firm. "Only when you truly love the work and the service, not just endure the sentence, will Amaka's final tether to this world be released and your soul find peace." Mama Neka listened without argument, her head bowed low. She finally understood that her task was not to suffer like Amaka, but to live in a way that honored the beautiful spirit she had destroyed. One of her new duties was to assist the older women in preparing the bodies and washing the linens for the recently deceased, a task considered the ultimate act of humble service. It was a close, intimate brush with mortality. As she washed a set of simple white burial cloths, the scent of the lye soap and damp linen was familiar. She remembered washing Amaka's small, still body, seeing the raw, silent evidence of neglect beneath the tattered clothing. Her hands, once accustomed to counting wealth and commanding servants, now moved gently over the fabric, imbued with a newfound respect for life and death. She felt the weight of every soul she prepared for its final journey. She carefully folded the clean cloths, her tears falling quietly onto the crisp linen. This was her deepest physical apology, the careful, tender handling of what remained, offering respect where she had only offered scorn. The act transformed from a penance into a ritual of healing. By serving the dead with kindness, she was, in a profound spiritual sense, serving Amaka, giving back the dignity she had so ruthlessly stolen. Following the elder's advice, Mama Neka spent several nights carving a simple wooden doll. She found a small piece of light, smooth Irako wood, and with clumsy but dedicated hands, she shaped the simple form of a little girl. She dressed the doll in a remnant of beautiful, vibrant blue cloth, a color Amaka would have loved. She even managed to weave a tiny necklace of glass beads, ensuring the doll possessed the beauty and care Amaka had never experienced. Under the deepest shadow of the moon, she took the doll to the acacia tree. She knelt by the small mound of earth and placed the doll at the foot of the grave, a small, tangible gift from a heart finally broken open by remorse. "This is for the laughter I stole," she whispered, her voice choked with sorrow. "This is for the games you never played, the joy I crushed. May your spirit know play and rest, little one." As she stood up, a single, deep, quiet breath escaped her lungs. It felt like the first truly free breath she had taken in years, confirming that her act of pure, selfless repentance had resonated with the spirit world. Ngozi, the woman who had held Amaka at the well, felt the lingering guilt keenly. She dedicated herself to establishing a small, heartfelt shrine at the site of Amaka's collapse, near the stone rim of the well. Every morning before beginning her own work, Ngozi brought a cup of clean, sweet river water and a spray of fresh flowers, bright red hibiscus and yellow marigolds, and placed them at the site, turning the spot of tragedy into a place of remembrance. Other women began to follow her example, leaving small tokens, smooth pebbles, a handful of dried grain, or a brief, silent prayer. The well was no longer just a source of water, but a constant, gentle reminder of the price of silence. Ngozi maintained this vigil for months, ensuring that Amaka, the child who suffered invisibly, would be seen and honored by all who approached the communal water source. It became a collective acknowledgement. Every time they drew water, they were reminded of the duty of care the community had failed, ensuring that such neglect could never happen again under the watchful eyes of Azu. During the monthly meeting of the village council, the elders discussed the unusual spiritual events and Mama Neka's public confession. The room was heavy with unstated understanding, the air thick with communal shame. Wayfi spoke of the spiritual truth. "We failed Amaka, not just Mama Neka. We valued tradition and non-interference over the life of a child. Our fear was greater than our duty." A profound silence followed his words, broken only by the crackle of the central fire. Every elder present knew he spoke the undeniable truth. They had seen the signs, heard the whispers, and done nothing. The council enacted a new, unwritten law: the immediate and unhesitating intervention on behalf of any child or vulnerable person in the village, regardless of the family's standing or claim to privacy. The legacy of Amaka was now cemented in the legal and moral consciousness of Azu, ensuring that her suffering would lead to a tangible, generational change in the community's ethical standards. The oldest storyteller, Okoro, began weaving a new narrative into his evening lessons for the village children. It was a tale of Amana, the small, gentle spirit who carried the weight of the world, but whose enduring light saved the village from a great drought of the heart. He spoke of the power of kindness, the danger of greed, and the ultimate, spiritual force that brings truth to light. He described the acacia's sudden bloom and the mystery of the vanishing water, using parable to teach morality. The children listened raptly, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. They learned Amaka's story not as a tragic warning, but as a mythic source of strength and a lesson in compassionate responsibility. Okoro ensured that the brutal details of the physical abuse were omitted, transforming Amaka's struggle into a timeless fable about the enduring power of the human and spiritual heart to demand justice and restore balance. The story planted a seed of moral courage in the next generation, ensuring Amaka's spirit lived on not as a ghost, but as a guiding star for the youth of Azu. The solitary hibiscus flower that had bloomed on the ancient acacia tree, impossibly out of season, remained a focal point for the village. It was a deep, vibrant red, a perfect splash of color against the dry, rough bark. Despite the changing weather, the flower defied nature, refusing to wilt. It became a living, visual testament to Amaka's enduring spirit, a quiet promise that light can emerge even from the deepest, darkest soil of sorrow. Villagers would pause beneath the tree, gazing up at the bloom, and feel a momentary lightness, a sense of peace that transcended the pain of the past. It was proof that the spiritual crisis had passed, replaced by a sacred, watchful presence. Children would dare one another to touch the flower, believing it conferred bravery. It was a tangible piece of magic, a miracle that anchored the community's belief in the unseen forces of justice. The acacia tree, once a silent witness to suffering, was now a vibrant sanctuary of remembrance and reconciliation, forever marked by Amaka's defiant, beautiful bloom. Young Chike, who had slipped Amaka the mango, carried his small secret act of rebellion for months. Finally, driven by the atmosphere of truth in the village, he confessed his deed to his mother. His mother, a stern but fair woman, listened and immediately burst into tears, hugging her son tightly. She wept not for the mango, but for her own failure to see the greater need and intervene in time. She praised Chike for his secret kindness, but shared her profound regret that she hadn't possessed his simple courage as an adult. His small, isolated act was now a lesson in active compassion for the whole family. Chike, now unburdened, went to the acacia tree. He placed a small, ripe mango at the foot of the grave, whispering, "I wish it could have been enough, Amaka." His small act of shared fruit, a moment of profound humanity, was finally brought into the open, proving that even the most fleeting kindnesses hold lasting power in the face of widespread neglect. The children of Azu, captivated by Okoro's stories and the visible signs of spiritual cleansing, began their own quiet movement. They would meet secretly at the riverbank, their own small council. They pledged an informal oath to each other, to never let another child suffer in silence. If they saw a friend hungry, overworked, or mistreated, they promised to tell their mothers, or even Ogbuefi himself, immediately. They established a secret signal, a small, distinct whistle, that meant look closer, something is wrong. It was a simple, yet revolutionary, commitment to active vigilance over one another. This pledge was the most lasting and positive outcome of Amaka's suffering, a grassroots, pure enforced promise to shatter the tradition of silence that had allowed injustice to thrive. The spirit of Amaka, in death, had forged a stronger, more compassionate community among the generation that would one day lead Azu. As a collective act of spiritual penance, the entire community gathered to clean and physically restore the well. They replaced the chipped, stained stone rim with smooth, polished river stones. Men hauled new wood to reinforce the structure, while women meticulously swept and cleaned the surrounding ground. Every action was deliberate, a ritual of healing the site of Amaka's final, exhausted collapse. They installed a plaque made of dark, heavy wood, inscribed with a single word, easily visible to all who approached: Amaka, a name now synonymous with vigilance and the sacred duty to nurture. By physically repairing the well, the community was symbolically washing away the village's shared guilt, transforming a place of tragedy into a powerful, functional monument to their renewed moral commitment. The clear, cold water drawn from the restored well now tasted sweeter, imbued with the integrity and hard-won compassion of the people of Azu. While sweeping the dusty path near the market, Mama Neka saw a young boy trip and fall, scraping his knee painfully on a sharp stone. The boy immediately burst into tears, frightened and hurt. For a moment, her old, hardened instinct to ignore the noise and continue her work resurfaced. But the image of Amaka's trembling hands flashed in her mind, and she stopped dead. She dropped her broom and knelt beside the crying child, gently lifting his leg. From the pouch tied to her waist, a pouch containing her humble working tools, she drew out a small amount of potent herbal paste, a remedy she had learned to make in her new life. She applied the cool paste with hands that had learned tenderness through regret, speaking to the boy in a low, soothing voice. She waited until the child's sobs subsided, and he offered her a shy, appreciative smile. This small, simple act of care, unsolicited and genuine, was a monumental step in her path of atonement, a clear, public demonstration that the wellspring of human kindness within her had finally been unblocked. The physical toll of her penance was visible, but the change in her face was more profound than her graying hair or the deepening lines on her skin. The hard, bitter creases of dominance around her mouth and eyes began to fade. Her face, once a mask of stern, unforgiving control, now carried the weary but gentle expression of one who has truly been humbled by fate and chastened by spirit. She looked like a tired old woman, not a cruel matriarch. She maintained a quiet, almost meditative focus on her work, moving slowly but deliberately through her daily chores. She accepted the occasional sympathetic glance or shared word from the villagers without shame or defense, only humility. Her transformation served as a powerful, living testimony to the community that even the most hardened heart could be broken open by remorse, and that forgiveness was possible, earned through enduring, genuine change. The softening of Mama Neka's physical appearance was the cinematic reflection of the healing of her soul, proving that the spiritual reckoning had achieved its highest purpose. One humid afternoon, Ngozi approached the well. Mama Neka was struggling to lift a full, heavy gourd onto her head, her aged body trembling with the strain. Her strength was clearly failing her. Ngozi walked over, not saying a word, and without looking at Mama Neka, placed a steadying hand on the side of the gourd, offering just enough support to help the frail woman complete the lift. Their eyes met only briefly. Ngozi's gaze held no resentment, only a quiet, solemn acceptance. Mama Neka managed a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the debt she could never repay. It was the first sign of genuine, direct human connection and tentative forgiveness offered to Mama Neka. This small, shared moment of labor, the passing of a single, heavy burden, was the climax of the village's journey toward reconciliation. The action spoke volumes. The village had learned to step in and offer support, breaking the pattern of isolated suffering that had killed Amaka. Please subscribe, share, like, and comment for more videos.